Hello, everyone. So it's the early hours of the 5th of September 2017. I want to talk about the North Korean crisis, and there will be things I'm saying in this video that are nothing, it's nothing new. I'm stating the obvious, but I just want to condense my thoughts about the current situation and express how I feel about this. I think this is definitely one of the defining issues, one of the defining news events of 2017. Um, and I think this time is different from the previous occasions. What I mean by that is that North Korea sort of testing the world is hardly anything new. For about the past 15 to 20 years, this has been a rogue state, so to speak. And I think that's a genuine statement of the world's perception because I honestly don't think it's just a Western perception. Japan and South Korea, I think, perceive this the same way. North Korea really is a unique country in terms of its antics. Um, I think what makes this different, this alleged hydrogen bomb that was tested yesterday apparently had a yield of anywhere from 5.7 to 6.3. At least the earthquake it caused was on that scale. And there's different sources saying different things, but every source agrees that this was the most powerful blast detonated so far. It is the sixth nuclear test so far. Um, the previous tests, of course, 2006, 2009, 2013, two in 2016, and this is the sixth, the fourth under Kim Jong-un. Um, an analyst has suggested that both South Korea and Japan have said it's the most powerful so far. Norwegian analysts have said it was even more powerful than the A bombs that dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that gives you some idea of this was a definitely large scale event. It's very, very difficult to know what the best approach from North Korea is. Clearly, Donald Trump is an unconventional president in his own right, so that definitely changes the game somewhat. Um, General Mattis made an interesting statement where he said, "We're not seeking to annihilate North Korea, but we're making it clear that that's something that the United States is obviously capable of." It goes without saying that the United States is a far, far superior power in every sense of the word. I read today, I don't know if this is true, but the entire economy of North Korea isn't even equitable to what the US spends on cats and dogs. So it's clearly not a level matchup. Not the United States can wipe out North Korea in a single strike. That goes without saying. But it also goes without saying that that isn't really an option because I think what the world is dealing with in Pyongyang is actually I read an analysis of this today that very often the cliche of Kim Jong Un is he's a madman. So understandable to see why. But the other thing to look at is maybe he's not mad; he's just bad. Um, and it's his iron grip on power, and it's this is perhaps playing the domestic audience to keep up this myth of his demigod sort of status. The Chinese position is very interesting because, on one hand, I think Beijing is genuinely frustrated with North Korea. I really don't think there's any great love lost between the two allies. They are allies, but I think it's a somewhat uncomfortable relationship. I always make this analogy. It's almost like China is a big brother trying to keep an eye on its mischievous little brother. Um, I think China is genuinely tired of North Korea's antics because they know that the ball always falls on them. China may also be an authoritarian regime, but it's genuinely seen as at least a growing up player on the world stage. I know that there's been Chinese state run newspapers and so on have been now increasingly getting frustrated at Western countries putting the onus on Beijing to rein in on the North. Um, Certainly, China doesn't want a nuclear North Korea, but what they also don't want is a conflict on the Korean Peninsula. What that would mean is a refugee crisis, potentially millions of North Korean refugees coming into China. The other scenario that China fears is in another all-out Korean conflict, assuming that the South prevails, which is very possible given it's got very powerful allies, then China would feel hemmed in because then you would have a unified Korea, presumably a democratic Korea, similar to Germany in 1990, on the Chinese border. So ideologically, obviously, they've got this single party regime in the north. But the comparisons between China and North Korea, there are some quite important differences. On one hand, they're both single party states, they're both authoritarian, and they both have appalling human rights abuses. I would suggest North Korea is far worse. Having been to China, I can honestly say I think China is a more open country overall. But there are also fundamental differences. Whereas China, the Chinese Communist Party is very wary of nepotism, whereas the very nature of the Kim regime is about nepotism. It's a family dynasty. In fact, it's arguably the world's only, with the possible exception of Cuba, the world's only communist dynasty. Um, and I think one major thing that could perhaps be a sign of optimism is if there was any chance of an internal coup within North Korea, some sort of situation whereby you had more moderate, if that's the right word, generals who could perhaps rein in on Kim Jong-un himself. Um, I think the way that would happen would be for some sort of disconnect between the mythology around his father and grandfather, but so far that hasn't really been the case because the personality cult is just as profound with Kim Jong Un, and he's shown himself to be even more ruthless than his father and grandfather. I do believe that China can do more, despite their protests that they're doing all they can. I mean, Xi Jinping didn't even mention this at the BRICS summit in Xiamen in the last few days. I do think China can do more. I think China can, for example, they back moderate sanctions, which is something in itself, but I think China can cut off supplies to the north. The problem with sanctions, and this is where it gets very complicated, when you have a regime like that in Pyongyang, sanctions genuinely don't hurt the dictatorship, they hurt the people. And these are people who are already suffering enough as it is. You know, desperate food shortages, annual severe flooding. That's the problem with sanctions. The intention is to punish the regime, but this is a regime that doesn't care about its own people. So it wouldn't act as a deterrent. Um, it's difficult to see President Trump and the United States continuing to hold back and do nothing about this. And I think it has come to a point now where it can no longer just be business as usual. Oh, well, we'll condemn this and then move on. I think that the North has to be seriously punished in some way. Um, and when history comes to be written, make no mistake about it, the North Korean regime isn't acting out of, okay, maybe they will say, and I'm sure North Korea apologists will say, oh, but they're just defending themselves from the American superpower and American military presence in the region backing up Japan and South Korea. But look at the propaganda videos. I mean, they speak for themselves. The North Korean regime relishes this. They're loving the military buildup. Um, I really don't think that, even if you dislike President Trump, I really don't think that Washington insiders want a conflict. It's not a question of who would win. The United States would win. It's a question of how complicated it could potentially get because China will inevitably have to take sides. And if it led to all out conflict, the best scenario with China would be to act as some sort of peacemaker, negotiator, but I think it's actually more realistic that China would reluctantly back the North. Um, Someone told me when I was in China, one of my students mentioned to me that ideologically the Chinese back the North because apparently Chairman Mao's son was killed in the Korean War. So there could be ideological romanticized reasons for that. I don't know. Um, it's very, very difficult to know what's going to happen with this because this, I do think this time is unique. Senior American officials like Leon Panetta have compared this to the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's no question about it. This particular period of the last few months of tensions is unlike anything before. I think this is exceptionally volatile, um, partly because President Trump has made it clear that he's not going to show much patience. If the North attacks Guam, and who knows whether that'll happen or not, Trump realistically could not act, especially given all his rhetoric, because that would look really phony if he was to give all the hardline rhetoric and then not do anything. Trump would have to act. Um, Likewise, in Tokyo and Seoul, Prime Ministers Abe and Moon cannot realistically stand by and do nothing when their people are being threatened. Um, Japan, of course, has re-looked at its constitution. It's reevaluating its wartime or post-war pacifist sort of world role. Um, Added to this, inevitably, and of course, there are all the other tensions going on in that part of the world with the disputes in the South China Sea. This is a very, very volatile situation. Um, you'll notice I'm now 11 and a half minutes into this video. I've deliberately not mentioned World War III scenarios. The reason for that is partly because I think it's an overdone cliche. There's been many tense moments since 1945 and in my lifetime that can be described as close to World War III. This situation has been compared to the Cuban Missile Crisis and the July crisis, which preceded World War One. World War Three is, I think, it's an overdone cliche. Definitely, it's conceivable that there would be a major conflict in the region on the scale of the Korean War, and that in itself should be alarming. You know, that conflict caused 3 million casualties, um, and of course, it never technically ended. But there is some cause for optimism as well. During the Cold War, 1945 to 1991, there was two superpowers standing off for 50 years, the United States and the Soviet Union, both nuclear powers, both major states, and people lived in constant fear of all-out nuclear war. It never happened. Now, if two major superpowers can prevent that, then it's easy to see North Korea being contained. The Soviet Union at its peak had something like 10,000 nuclear weapons. North Korea has a couple at most. So, whilst it's certainly an unhinged and very, very brutal regime, I think it's easier perhaps to contain. It is true that it's unhinged. It's true that it acts irrationally, but it's difficult to see North Korea in itself starting a global conflict. I think that the major powers in the region, even if they disagree on the exact approach, Russia, China, the United States, Japan, South Korea, and then on the Allied side, if that's the right word, backed by Britain and Australia, and presumably Canada as well, are not going to allow this to get so out of hand where it would lead to a global conflict. So I don't think this is necessarily going to lead to a global conflict. But I do believe this is the most serious it's probably ever been. And I think President Trump, on one hand, I don't think it's realistic to expect Washington to show patience and to simply take the same line that it has always had to take with this. I think there needs to be multiple approaches. China can complain, but I think they can do more. I mean, the Chinese state editorials can't exactly whinge about the rest of the world asking them to do more when they are actively sending supplies to North Korea. They can't play two games here. A military option obviously is not something that should be taken lightly. I don't know if it will come to that. What may happen is some sort of coup d'etat. I could actually see a situation where the CIA organizes some sort of coup d'etat to get internal generals to overthrow the Kim regime. China wouldn't like that, but that would be surely a preferable option to an all out military conflict. So, anyway, that's the situation. And I'm going to obviously be keeping very close eye on developments. Um, Now, my country's not a Pacific power, but Boris Johnson recently said he wants to make Britain more of a Pacific observer and to increase our role, particularly post Brexit, in the Pacific region. We're not a Pacific power, but we are still a major naval power. I mean, we've just got the Queen Elizabeth class of warships, which only a few other countries in the world can match that, and only a few other countries surpass that. The United States, of course, possibly China, but Britain is still a major naval power, so it'll be interesting to see what role we play in this if it does indeed escalate. Obviously, for the sake of the world, I hope things don't escalate. I've got many Chinese friends. I don't want to see a situation where the West finds itself at war with China. That would be tragic. But I do think China can do more. And I suppose I have to put a caveat here. I completely support ideologically, the rest of the world versus North Korea, but I do think that Trump also needs to be careful with some of his rhetoric. We know that Kim Jong Un's a nut. We know that he's irrational, but I'm not sure if fire and fury is exactly the best way forward. I can understand the need to talk tough. I can understand the need to be assertive, but I'm not sure if that sort of language particularly helps. Okay, we'll see. We'll see how this goes. Final point: if North Korea does attack Guam, and even they backed off at the last minute, that would be really a very serious situation because Washington is not going to stay quiet if that happens. And, well, we'll see what develops. The problem is both sides now have used the highest rhetoric they could possibly use. You can't get much higher than threatening to wipe out the Yankee imperial bastards and, pardon my language, and threatening fire and fury. Doesn't get much more intense than that. So at this point, it can only go down. That's a cause for optimism. Okay, let me know your thoughts. Thanks for watching.